We turn now to a couple of troubling stories about criminal waste of government defense funds. This week in San Diego, 7 men were arrested after reportedly admitting to a fraud and corruption scheme. The 4 Navy officials and 3 defense contractors pleaded guilty in March to a conspiracy where the contractors gave the Navy men over $1 million worth of gifts. These gifts include everything from cash to flat screen TVs to home improvements. In addition to their prison sentences, each defendant is required to pay restitution to the Department of the Navy, among other financial penalties. Meanwhile, a video recently released by ABC shows security contractors in Afghanistan partying themselves to oblivion, getting drunk and stoned, even shooting up on prescription drugs. Now, these are the same guys that are part of a $47 million government contract to train the Afghan police force. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by J.D. Tuccilli, managing editor of Reason 24/7. J.D., welcome. So we are at a time now where we hear constant rhetoric from political leaders about cutting the nation's budget deficit. And with billions of dollars pumped into the so-called military-industrial complex, why isn't there more oversight over these defense contracts?
Well, you said yourself, there's billions of dollars flowing through here. There's so much money flowing through here that overseeing it all is absolutely impossible. Hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, operations elsewhere in Africa, North Africa. So at some point along the way, people are going to start skimming money off, and that money is going to be substantial because so much money is flowing through the works.
Now, we just looked at a few examples there. Some of them are particularly humiliating, but how widespread do you think this problem is?
Well, in terms of the money, I think that the corruption is extremely widespread. In terms of drug and alcohol use, I think it's also enormously widespread. That's always been the case in military settings. The difference now is that we have little video cameras, and people who are offended by this, rightfully offended by it, can record it, and we can see it. It went on in Vietnam. It went on in World War II. Soldiers have always gotten drunk and they've gotten high, whatever's available, because they're alternating between boredom and terror. And it's a testosterone-rich environment. Relatively few women modulate their worst behavior. If that is going to modulate their worst behavior, it might not. And they indulge themselves because they can.
Now, is there any indication of just how much money goes down the drain from these bad defense contracts?
Well, in this case, I think there were several $1 million worth of contracts at stake and about $1 million in bribes in return. That would seem to be a relatively, it's a decent return, millions of dollars in return for $1 million. This is one case where they were caught. We don't know exactly how much of it is going on, obviously. They catch what they catch, and then we hear about it when they do. I would assume that a lot of it is happening. There's a lot of money at stake, and if people can get a piece of that pie, and it's a huge pie, they're going to do everything they can. Corruption is a long-time game, dating back to the Civil War, when they used to sell rotten pork and beef to the Union Army. Nothing really has changed since then. Now it's prepackaged meals and replacement parts, but it's the same game.
All right, so it's a long-running and widespread problem, and we're seeing these specific examples of government waste due to these government contracts. Is this a place for government officials to look when they're talking about making cuts?
Well, I would hope so. The problem is when you have so much money at stake, $1 million in bribes is a tiny percentage of what's actually being expended by the U.S. government. There's going to be corruption any time there's money being spent, at least a little bit of it. Yes, they should look at this. We don't need people being bribed in return for useless contracts. The reason these bribes are being offered is because the contracts wouldn't otherwise be proffered to these companies. These companies are buying business that they wouldn't otherwise get. So yes, the taxpayers are getting ripped off here, and we shouldn't accept that. But it's going to happen because there's so much money involved. There's so much money available. Someone is going to try to take a piece of that. So yes, the government should be looking at this.
Okay, and is there a sign that the government needs to do something about the way, not just making the cuts to begin with, but the way that they do business with these defense contractors, the way that they give them out?
Well, yeah, I think we should see more transparency. The Feds seem incapable of policing themselves. If they were to post these contracts more publicly, so that the public at large knows who this business is going to, and who's buying it, who's being offered the contracts, so that the public at large has a chance to police it and detect bribery and corruption where it's occurring in an open source way. I think there's a better chance of at least minimizing it, certainly not eliminating it, but minimizing the corruption.
Now, I want to ask you, JD, because we see this widespread, this waste in these government contracts. And at the same time, you also hear reports within the military of soldiers within the Air Force or in other branches not having the equipment that they need. Soldiers flying aircraft that are unsafe because of a shortage of funding. How does that happen? How is money directed into a place where it's wasted when in other areas that money is much needed and can be put to better use?
Well, that's partially, so a lot of these expenditures are politicized, and that is partially an outcome of the corruption, too. When contracts are being awarded to companies that buy them, that bribe officials, obviously those are resources that are being diverted from elsewhere, and that elsewhere might be something where they're very much needed. But somebody didn't offer that bribe. So the money isn't spent on a needed expenditure. It's spent instead on a politicized or corrupt expenditure. And of course, there are just explicitly politicized expenditures, favored companies, districts that have powerful senators and congressmen representing them. And money gets spent there instead of where it might necessarily be needed. Not out of corruption necessarily, but in order to satisfy political appetites.
Well, a very important topic and timely now with an election coming up. JD, really appreciate you coming on the show. That was JD Tuccille, managing editor of Reason 24/7 News.
Thanks for having me on.